How are we today? We're right in the middle of the book by Michael Banner on Christian ethics and contemporary moral problems, and it's obvious that we're not going to completely review this book. We spent a considerable amount of time on the practice of abortion, a critique, because that, to a certain extent, might be considered the last thing that a ethicist might want to bring up because of its very controversial nature. And it may be better to pick some other ethical problem which is somewhat less controversial to illustrate Christian ethical thinking. On the other hand, the abortion critique very well illustrates Christian ethical thinking, because one of the problems that Banner brings out is that even though he is quite an intelligent and well-informed person and can talk intelligently about all of the possible arguments and all of the possible considerations that people have brought to the question of abortion, his main point is that from the perspective of Christian ethics, the question is much more simple than the continuing debate would allow. That is, from the Christian perspective, getting involved too extensively in arguments about the status of the fetus or the time at which the fetus becomes valuable, or the whether it's at so many days or at viability, or whether the fetus has a soul, and if so, what difference does that make? From what Banner is trying to say is that all of these issues will be debated for eternity, probably, and that the issue having to do with Christianity is, again, very simple. It's the same as we talked about in terms of Ramsey, and that is that Christianity is theocentric, and in the case of Christianity, Christocentric, which means that we don't determine, as Christians do not determine, the value of human beings based on some philosophical notion of whether it has a soul, or if so, when the soul arrives, or on some biological considerations of when a child or fetus is viable. These are all interesting considerations. But when it gets right down to it, the Christian perspective is very simple. Is the fetus or the child, whichever you want to call it, is the fetus or the child something that Christians should consider a gift of God which should be welcomed? And if it is, especially since it's a gift of God of a person who should be welcomed, then a great many considerations fall by the wayside, because if our primary consideration is the well-being of other people who already are alive and who already exist as human beings, or if our primary consideration is the psychological or social or economic well-being of the mother or the father or anybody else, then basically you've skipped from the Christian perspective the most important consideration, and that is, are we in a position to reject the gift that God has given? Now, that is a theological faith affirmation. In a sense, it just kind of stops the debate. But a Christian ethicist cannot help that if it kind of stops the debate. That doesn't mean that the Christian ethicist cannot participate in the debate in the public sector, because there are a lot of ways that a Christian ethicist who understands the problem and who understands the philosophical and historical background could contribute to clarification in terms of the debate. When Christian ethicists debate abortion in the public sector, and by the way, I want to go back and underline the fact that a great many people assume that the only Christians who are opposed to abortion on demand or abortion from what is called social indications. Some people assume that the only Christians who are opposed to abortion in general are are Christian fundamentalists, are people that are sometimes described on the political right, the Christian right. And that is simply a little bit of misinformation that comes from the fact that most Christian ethicists do not have public forum like the nightly news in which to express their opinions, because the nightly news generally does not invite anyone who has a nuanced view of anything. The nightly news will invite a so-called pro-choice or pro-abortionist, and it will invite a so-called anti-choice, pro-life, and those two people are going to sit there and talk to each other, hopefully, sometimes scream at each other. And the fact of the matter is that such a juxtaposition that usually takes place in most media leaves out the majority of Christian ethical thinking, which is somewhat more nuanced and certainly somewhat more theologically oriented. It's just one of my prejudices that you will not get a very theologically nuanced or a very ethically nuanced position on any public issue if you only pick out people on the right and on the left. Most people who are in the pro-choice or pro-abortion camp, again, people don't like to be called names, but so pro-choice would probably be a better name for these folks, since that's what they prefer. Most of these people come from an ethical position which is sometimes called consequentialism. And if you look at the screen, in popular terms, consequentialism is the doctrine that the ends justify the means. No action is, as such, in and of itself wrong. Now, that is probably the prevailing ethical assumption of modern people, particularly people who are primarily secular or humanistic in their orientation. In fact, one man made a very telling point, and that is, if the ends do not justify the means, what does? The idea being, you're going to have to find out what the consequences are in order to understand whether your action is justifiable or not. Well, people used to say, and a lot of people still say, the end does not justify the means. Well, you may think that that is a winning argument, but it's a winning argument only if that's the presupposition from which you begin. If you're a consequentialist, which a great many modern people are, that is not the presupposition from which you begin. The presupposition from which you begin is that if the ends do not justify something, then what does? No action, because no action as such is in and of itself wrong. Whether or not an action is wrong is always an open or contingent question, even in the sense that one will, in each and every case, have to consider whether or not the action under consideration is likely to have, on balance, more good consequences than bad, and whether it is in particular that one which offers the best such balance. Everybody, of course, wants to be balanced, and consequentialists also want to be balanced. So in the question of abortion, you want to balance the interests of the pregnant mother, you want to balance the interest of the fetus. You've got to find out, or you've got to make some kind of decision on what the interests of the pregnant mother are, and what the interest of the fetus is. But what you're trying to do is balance things, and an argument may go on one side that a pregnant mother who is too young to take care of a child is basically going to produce an unwanted child, and therefore is going to contribute to the burden on herself that will make it very difficult for her to make it economically, or to become educated, or to be able to raise a healthy child, because she's not mature enough and she's not And so she will get into all kinds of trouble psychologically and socially in the development of this child. And that basically is what is called the social indication that abortion is justified. On the other hand, if you're on the other end of the spectrum, what are you going to argue? Well, you're going to argue first that you believe that the status of the fetus is such that you cannot make a decision on the life and death of that fetus on some social indication, any more than you can make the decision about the life and death of a 6-week-old or a 6-month-old child on the basis of social indications. Because a 6-week-old child, that is one that has come to term and has been born to a very poor, immature, young mother, is in exactly the same situation as far as its future is concerned as a fetus that's just a few weeks old. And so from the perspective of those on the other side then, you're jumping the major hurdle in order to get to a consideration of how this is going to affect the mother. We would not do that if the child were 6 months old. We wouldn't jump that hurdle. Even if the child were handicapped, even if the child were the child or the product of a rape, even if the child were a product of a kind of an accidental conjugation between an immature young boy or man and an immature young woman. And even though that child, as it stands at the present, it probably is in jeopardy in several ways in terms of its upbringing, its nurture, its ability to thrive, and its education, we still would not jump the hurdle of its own value as a human being. So that's the way the argument kind of stands on both sides. One of them is a consequentialist argument. The other is an argument that is based on either the theological or philosophical value of the fetus itself. One says that the act of terminating a pregnancy is neither good nor bad within itself. It depends on what the consequences are. The other side probably would agree with that, except that they would have this caveat. The consequences of the termination of a pregnant is the killing of a human being, if you begin with that presupposition. Therefore, already you know what the consequences are. And the consequences of killing a human being will probably override any discomfort or inconvenience of society or of the mother or of anybody else involved. So that's kind of where the public discussion stands. As I already indicated last time, we are not really at the present situation in terms of Roe versus Wade and in terms of the legality or the illegality of abortion, because we have actually gone through the process of theological and ethical and philosophical thinking. We're at this position because the Supreme Court basically has decided not to decide any of these issues, and has decided that the right to privacy, which from some people's perspectives is inherent in the Constitution, from other people's perspectives they never heard of being in the Constitution. The right to privacy, namely the privacy of the pregnant mother, supersedes all other constitutional considerations. And so in a sense, the Supreme Court has decided that the fetus does not have the same status as a 6-month-old child, because I think probably if the killing of a 6-month-old child went to the Supreme Court, the right to privacy would not prevail. So whether or not an action is wrong is always an open or contingent question in consequentialism, in the sense that one will in each and every case have to consider whether or not the action under consideration is likely to have on balance more good consequences than bad, and whether it is in particular that one which offers the best such balance. Now, it is easy to see that for one who approaches the issue of abortion with consequentialist assumptions, questions about the status of the fetus can have no determinative significance. It may also be that for some consequentialists, certainly not for all, the status of the 6-month-old child may have no determinative significance. That's certainly true of some contemporary philosophers, some of which teach at some very prestigious universities. In fact, one of whom teaches at a university which was established as a religious university. But he now argues, to the chagrin of some of the faculty on his, some of his colleagues on the faculty, that there is no status that is inherent in the life of a 6-month-old child that should preclude society or the mother or anyone else being allowed to dispense with the child, because it is not yet a human being. There, of course, is where all of this finally comes down to. And I don't know what's going to happen in the future in terms of the stretching of the law to include children after they are born. But on the basis of some consequentialist assumptions, that is an open question that should be decided in the light of the situation. Perhaps the fetus is a person, and perhaps, if these are thought to be different propositions, it can be said to possess a soul. And those are different propositions. For a great many people who are philosophically minded, the question of when or where the soul enters into the fetus is an extremely important thing. So, for instance, on one end of the spectrum is the traditional Roman Catholic view that the soul exists in the fetus at the moment of conception. At the moment of conception, everything is there that's ever going to be there in terms of substance. At the other end of the spectrum, there are some religious people, some religious views, that the person actually doesn't begin until the actual birth takes place. I've read arguments on that basis, both from some liberal Jewish perspectives and from some liberal Protestant perspectives. That is, that a person is simply a person is not a person until he's born. And once he is born, then all of the constitutional protections and so forth come into play. But since the killings of persons is like any other action, by the way, I was going to say that in the thought of a number of biblical theologians, including a number of Protestant theologians, the question of whether the fetus has an immortal soul is an irrelevant question, because the idea of a person having an immortal soul is not really basically a biblical idea. And so that's not one basis upon which some ethicists would argue the value of the fetus that has an immortal soul. If a 30-year-old does not have an immortal soul in the Platonic or Aristotelian sense, then we shouldn't argue on the basis of the fetus having an immortal soul that is what protects him. There should be, if he's going to be protected, some other basis upon which to protect him. And rather than a philosophical basis, most Christian ethicists go toward a theological basis. But since the killing of persons is, like any other action in principle, always on the agenda, abortion cannot just be ruled out, but must always be considered amongst the repertoire of actions which may or may not contribute to the achievement of the most desirable state of affairs. These consequentialism, for instance, gets involved in all kinds of ethical dilemmas, like lifeboat ethics. You're in a lifeboat, and you have 20 different people there. And if you're the captain and or if you're the at least the captain of the lifeboat, then you have a choice under certain circumstances to pick out some people to throw overboard, or maybe even to eat, in order to save the lives of the other people. And so consequentialism then begins a kind of a calculus. On what basis do we save, for instance, a small child as over a person who is a renowned doctor? On what basis do we save a woman over a man? On what basis do we save the captain over anybody else in the boat? A consequentialist would have a field day with any kind of dilemma of this sort, whereas someone operating totally from the perspective of a theological perspective, in which everybody in the boat is of equal value because they are persons who have the image of God, then if anybody is going to get out of the boat, generally a Christian ethicist would say that it's quite possible and quite Christianly ethical for someone to jump, but not for somebody to prepare him for a meal. And that's just different ways of looking at an ethical dilemma. There are severe problems with the sort of calculus of consequences which consequentialism presupposes. To determine that a course of action amongst all the alternatives which offers the best balance of good and bad consequences requires not only a remarkable ability to peer into an uncertain future. For instance, you make the decision in the lifeboat. You actually grab somebody and throw him overboard, or you actually perform a murder or a killing on one member of the lifeboat, and you get ready to prepare him to eat, which has happened numerous times. And a plane appears, and that has happened in certain circumstances, and people then become extremely embarrassed because they have actually participated in cannibalism, or they have actually participated in throwing somebody overboard, when in actual fact they did not know the future, and the future would have allowed them not to have eaten those people. Now that's an ugly example to use, but it's an example which shows the problematic nature of consequentialism in determining life and death, even in critical circumstances. There may be times in which that has to be done. If you're involved in an action which is kind of problematic itself, for instance, if you're involved in an action of war, you sometimes have to make a choice between killing one person in order to save the life of another. So those are situations in which those things might arise. But also a not so much remarkable as questionable ability in comparing and weighing highly diverse outcomes. The problem of comparing cabbages and kings, as it is sometimes characterized. In other words, if life were as calculable as sometimes consequentialism indicates, then obviously if you've got the choice between a cabbage and a king, you throw the cabbage out. But it's never that simple in a dilemma of this kind. Now, just to sum up our abortion thing before we get into anything else, someone might assume that the best stance for a Christian ethicist is to kind of be in between the left and the right on the question of abortion. That sounds balanced, that sounds moderate, but Banner has this to say about that. One should not suppose that the best thing would be to position oneself between the advocates of a right to choose and the right to life, as self-proclaimed moderates might conceive of themselves as doing. Placing oneself here may perhaps generate a certain sense of virtue, since one can persuade oneself that one thereby partakes both of the fidelity to the tradition which seems to belong to those who proclaim a right to life, and also the open-mindedness and sophistication which seems, but only seems, to belong to those who proclaim a right to choose. He's saying that either one of these positions only seem to belong to each of these groups. Now that, of course, is a judgment on his part. But however that may be, the intellectual merits of this position are non-existent, since it does not represent a higher and principal synthesis of these two positions, but a mere averaging of them in a refusal to make a judgment. Now that's basically the position we're in America and in England. Even those people who are in the middle are in a position, in a sense, of averaging the two sides and landing up in the middle, and therefore refusing to make a judgment, at least in terms of law or in terms of social policy. And that may be where we stay, because Michael Banner is not under the illusion that a bunch of Christians are going to go out and completely change the present atmosphere that surrounds the pro-life, pro-choice battle. But in a sense, what Michael is saying is that if you just kind of take the middle position, then you are deserting the integrity of your own position. You should still propose your own position and stay with the integrity of your own position, whether or not you're going to convince 10% of the American people on any particular subject. A community which knows human life to be created, reconciled, and redeemed in Jesus Christ will be a community which, in its acceptance of children, gives expression to its characteristic virtues of faith, hope, and love. Christians, Banner is saying, should not necessarily be hopeful or be given any kind of assurances that their view of abortion or of the value of children or the value of fetuses is going to be accepted by the general culture, because it may not be accepted by the general culture. And one of the reasons why it won't be is if a certain percentage of the general culture who have very important positions and who have very important place in public policy making, or have a very important place in deciding what Constitution means or deciding what law means, if they don't believe that human life is created, is reconciled and redeemed in Jesus Christ, then it's really kind of imperialism for Christians to expect everybody to agree with them on abortion. But just because everybody, most people, 90%, 99% of the people in any particular culture don't agree with Christians does not mean that Christians should kind of just compromise on that issue. They may compromise on the legal issue, they may compromise on the cultural issue, they may compromise on any other issue. But they can't bring themselves to compromise on the issue that a child is the creation of God that Christians should welcome. And so whenever they are in a position to promote that view, they should feel not just free, but compelled to promote that view. They should not feel compelled to interfere with the rights of free speech or the rights of action, of legal action particularly, that other people are involved in. Christians should not even necessarily feel compelled to intervene in illegal action that other people are involved in. That might be a difficult choice that Christians sometimes may make. For instance, Martin Luther King felt compelled to intervene in illegal action that was taking place in the South. But on the other hand, the legality or illegality of some of those things that he was acting against may or may not have been actually worked out legally. They obviously weren't for the people in some parts of the South. On the other hand, what a Christian needs to understand is that quite often in history, including in the United States, including in the state of Texas, including in Houston, injustice is more often than not legal. Slavery, for instance, was legal. Most of the things that Adolf Hitler did were legal. If you make the laws, you can declare something to be legal. But someone who has a higher ethical criterion may still not accept your law and may work to try to overcome your law. May work, for instance, to try to overcome slavery, may become a prohibitionist. And a prohibitionist in the United States could be a prohibitionist as long as he just talked. He could not be a prohibitionist if he actually went out and tried to help people by helping them to escape or even carrying on an armed rebellion against slavery. So, but these folks, even though some of the actions that they did were illegal, they still considered it to be necessary. In other words, Christian ethics is not a democratic process. Whereas a great many things that happen in our legal system and in our judicial system are the result of the kind of democratic process that we have put in motion. And in our last class period, one of the things that I hope you've been thinking about is how a Christian position with integrity can look at our judicial system, our legal system, our criminal justice system. And can it be at all possible that a Christian ethicist would declare our criminal justice system to be just fine, even though most of what our criminal justice system does is legal? Can we say that it's just fine, or can we say there are things about this system which are illegal that we can certainly point out, but there are also some things about this system that are illegal? And the fact that it's illegal, about the system that is legal, and the fact that it's legal may be that we may never be able to change it. For instance, if you happen to be a Christian who is opposed to the death penalty, for whatever reason, your advocacy of opposition to the death penalty certainly cannot be based on the majority opinion in the state of Texas, because the majority of opinion in the state of Texas is in favor of the death penalty. So your position has to have a little bit more integrity than that. So a community which knows human life to be created, reconciled, and redeemed has to look at all of these issues in a different way. With faith in the goodness of God's creation, a hope in His providential dealings with it, and a love appropriate to His regard for it, such a community would welcome children with a simplicity which is presupposed by Bonhoeffer's quick way with abortion. You remember what Bonhoeffer's quick way with abortion is? He says, there's no use going into a discussion, philosophical or consequentialist discussion of whether a woman should abort her fetus. That's not an option for a Christian. Once we have grasped this perspective, we can understand the very obviousness, as Bonhoeffer saw it, of the simple view, and furthermore, can understand the force of traditional Roman Catholic teaching in relation to certain hard cases. Now, Banner does not necessarily agree with the Roman Catholic tradition on some of these things. He may not even specifically agree with some of the consequences of Bonhoeffer's position. But he is very keen, as they would say in England, he is very keen to let it be known that there is a sophisticated, profound position which is almost absolutist in terms of abortion. Just like there is a there is a sophisticated, honorable position of integrity that is absolutely opposed to capital punishment, or which is absolutely opposed to slavery, or is absolutely opposed to a number of other things that sometimes the majority of people have been in favor of in various cultures. And I remind you again of the statement he made earlier, and we'll end the abortion discussion here, when he said, some people talk in terms of our culture being one in which there are unwanted children, so we have to figure out what to do with them. And one of the ways in which we can handle that issue is by fetal abortion. Well, what Banner says is, perhaps Christians can think in terms of a culture in which there are no unwanted children. And from Banner's perspective, and from Bonhoeffer's perspective, and from Barth's perspective, and from most of these older theologians at least, you can imagine a culture in which there are no unwanted children. Certainly you should imagine a Christian community in which there are no unwanted children. And so if there are any unwanted children outside of that community, they are not really unwanted. You simply have to get the message to them that they are wanted. You have to get the message to the mothers, or you need to get the message to whoever's in charge of those children. Okay, does anybody have a question on any of this stuff? Yeah.
Okay, why is there such a difference between how abortion doctors are treated and how a doctor like Dr. Kevorkian is treated? You know, like he aids in suicide, when both are, you know, seemingly unethical practices, and they both aid in killing a person.
Well, I'm not going to be involved in judgment as to the relative merits or ethical nature, or even humanistic nature of either of those people. But the simple fact of the matter is that Kevorkian broke the law, and an abortion doctor is not breaking the law. An abortion doctor would have been breaking the law in some states, in fact most states, before Roe versus Wade. And so a Christian ethicist has to keep in mind that from a Christian ethical perspective, whether or not he's breaking the law or not is really not a determinative issue. From the perspective of Christian ethics, you shouldn't shoot doctors who are obeying the law, and you shouldn't shoot doctors who are disobeying the law. And so it would have been totally in opposition to Christian ethics for someone to have put a hit out on Kevorkian. There are some people who call themselves Christians of the ultra nationalistic right who might have put a hit out on Kevorkian. And if he had done that and people had found some so-called Christian literature in his home, then that would have been another argument against the position of Christians against euthanasia. But of course, that's just dirty fighting. Killing your opponent is very dirty fighting. But assuming that all of your opponents on either side of the issue are somehow violent and unethical is also dirty playing. One of the interesting things that's happened in the last few years is that the so-called Church of the World Creator has become prominent in the media because its founder, who has never been arrested for what he says, its founder believes that the white race is the only divine race. And since he says he believes in God, a lot of media people just kind of jump to the conclusion that he considers himself a Christian. Because there are some Christian racists. There are some Christian white racists, white supremacists. But the man who went around shooting, for instance, shot an Oriental man and then shot up a Jewish school, was a disciple of the World Church the Church of the World Creator. And if you read the material of the Church of the World Creator, its founder had been raised as a Christian, but he determined that Christians were too anti-racist. And so he decided to preach a God who he could better support as being a racist, or who he would preach a God who would better support him as a racist. And so basically that proves that he's a fairly intelligent young man, because he realizes that if you actually take Christian theology, biblical theology, Christian ethics seriously, that you cannot use it to justify racism. So he's gone somewhere else. But I still hear news commentators saying the ultra-right Christian group, the Church of the World Creator. Well, it may not be a bad thing to make that guy angry, but that sure makes him angry, because he wants to make it clear that he's not a Christian. From his perspective, Christianity has succumbed so much to what he calls mongralism that Christianity is useless anymore to the preserving of racial integrity. So you can find people all the way from the ultra anti-Christian right. There's an interesting perception that the right is always Christian. You have to make a distinction between the right and the Christian right, because the Christian right is not all there is to the right. And the right many times goes way beyond the Christian right, because the Christian right at least generally has some leftovers of Christian theology, Christian love, Christian ethics, whereas the non-Christian right, which would be closer to the Church of the World Creator, which would be closer to Nazism, to fascism, and to other kinds of groups of this type, are not bound in the least by Christian ethics. And so they very easily can be talked into shooting doctors and other kinds of things. Unfortunately, sometimes even the leaders of the Christian pro-life movement, who don't believe in shooting doctors who perform abortions, are not courageous enough to say out loud and firmly and with great vigor that that is not a Christian thing to do. It's not even a Christian thing to go up and hit him in the face. It's not a Christian thing to do to yell damnation at him. That's not a Christian thing to do. It's not a Christian thing to do, for instance, for this guy from Topeka, Kansas, to go around to funerals of gay people and shout, "God hates fags and so is burning in hell." That's not a Christian thing to do. I don't care if the man calls himself a Baptist. That's not a Baptist thing to do. You can find almost no Baptists in the United States that would do something like that. But you can find one or two, and they're the ones that get on television. All the other Baptists are sitting at home saying, "I wish that guy would get out of here," but they're not. Their quotes are not usually put on TV. I don't know whether that answered your question. I talked around it quite a bit. Anybody else have anything to talk about? Yeah.
Concerning the consequentialism that we were talking about earlier, it seems as though that type of ethical judgment seems as if it makes paramount human affections and desires. Is that really any sound basis for ethical judgment, your affections and your desires?
Well,
comment on that?
It not only makes that is a very substantial and well-supported ethic in human history. Consequentialism, the man he mentions particularly is Jeremy Bentham. Consequentialism is based on the assumption that since there is no God who is actually telling us what is good and what is bad, or telling us what we should do in certain situations, or telling us how we should feel about things, then the then our ethical decisions would be based on what we feel the consequences should be. And that's a very tempting position to be in. For instance, if a person has a daughter who has made a bad choice and she has gotten pregnant, even a father who has been basically Christian in his view of this subject all his life is going to be tempted to do what? He's going to be tempted to maybe even suggest that his little girl get an abortion and keep it secret, because that is going to help her. And who wants, you know, if you don't have a little girl or if you don't have a child, you can't imagine how much a father wants to help his children. Wants to help his children from getting into bad situations. Wants to help his children from failing, keep from failing. And so that's a very important thing. What a lot of people don't realize is that quite often this very natural emotional desire does not necessarily give you the ethical justification for doing that. Not only that, but you don't even know what the consequences are. Among the consequences are that your daughter, somewhat later, when she's older, is going to have some problems with what she did. The consequences are that one child who was supposed to be born is not going to be born. Because that's a social indication. For instance, if the father who did this is a middle-class father, then the social indication had nothing to do even with the girl being poor, or not having a good family, or not being possible that the child be educated. So a lot of those social indications aren't there. Just the desire to want your little girl not to be embarrassed and not to be looked down upon is a very tempting thing. So if it weren't for these kinds of considerations, there would be no need for thinking ethically. Thinking ethically, at least from the Christian perspective, means thinking from a different perspective than just what you happen to be feeling at any particular time. That doesn't mean we always do that, but at least ethics is supposed to point out that there are times in which we do that. Now let me talk a little bit about the chapters on economic devices and on the why and how not to value the environment. And then he has a chapter on biotechnology. Now he is a specific expert, Banner, on biotechnology and the environment. He serves on some very prestigious British boards in regard to these things. That was kind of his specialty in college. As a result, you may have noticed that these chapters are extremely intricate in their argumentation. But what I would like to say about these chapters to try to help you is that if you've gotten bogged down in the very intelligent, intricate arguments that Banner has made, that you need to understand that he feels about these things the same way he feels ultimately about the abortion thing. And that is, the Christian answer to these questions is really very simple. It is not detailed. It is very simple. Take the environment. He talks about all of these attempts to set a presupposition for dealing with various things. ethically. For instance, he talks about anthropocentrism. What does that mean? Anthropocentrism. If you do not begin with theocentrism, and if you don't believe in God, you'd have to be crazy to begin with theocentrism. So if you don't begin with theocentrism, sometimes your first option, the first option that modern secularists and humanists generally go to, is anthropocentrism, that is, man-centered. Now, there are all kinds of centrism upon which people base in our culture their ethical decisions. And some of these ethical presuppositions lead people to calm discussions of policy issues, to actually trying to get involved in a democratic and political way in getting into a position where you can affect policy issues. For instance, there are people right now in Bush's cabinet who evidently have made policy issues which George Bush doesn't even know about until they get into the newspaper, and that embarrasses George Bush, and so he has to backtrack and try to do. Well, those people have probably worked hard to get into that position, and they have certain centricisms. For instance, they may be anthropocentric or anthrocentric, which means that all of their decisions are going to be made on what benefits human beings and will not take into any consideration what benefits animal life or the environment. And there are some of those folks in any administration. On the other hand, some of the more extreme folks, like the zoocentric, that is, people who believe that animals should be the central focus of all ethical decisions, are even more widely environment. The environment per se, in itself, has to be the basis upon which all ethical decisions are made. And I suppose you can make all kinds of distinctions even with this. You could talk about a centrism of sentient beings. You could talk about a biocentric idea, that is, a centrism of living things. But you can also talk about a centrism of non-living things. In fact, some centrism has as its vision, as its theological vision, that the whole universe is itself an organism, a living organism. And so, from their perspective, they have turned. This is kind of a theocentric perspective, because the universe itself, the earth itself, is made into a god or a goddess. And so, whatever you do, you should do for the benefit of the goddess, no matter how it affects human beings or any other animals. On the other hand, you can go all the way to the opposite extreme, and a number of animal rights groups, for instance, are in this category. And that is, it really doesn't make any difference what happens to human beings in a struggle. It really doesn't make any difference what happens to human economy and human political structure and so forth in the struggle. We've got to protect any biological creature from having anything imposed upon them by human beings. Now, this is a very strong ethical cult, and we see lots of violence taking place. For instance, at the recent meetings in Seattle and in Quebec, you have a very wide spectrum of environmentalists that have kind of converged on these cities. The only ones we hear very much about are the ones that are committed to violent action to get attention to their programs. Meanwhile, most of the people there are not committed to violent action. But none of these nuances are brought out very much, because the only thing we're going to see is people throwing bottles at policemen and policemen shooting tear gas canisters at certain people. So as a result, it might behoove environmentalists to realize that a lot of them are not going to get their message across if they are perceived to be in unity or in concert with some of these folks who get headlines only by being violent. But they also may be so committed to their particular environmental views that they are actually going to allow people who are violent to draw attention to their views. And so it's a very mixed bag, this kind of thing. But you can become centric, or you can make anything central. For instance, you can do a pretty good ethical discussion on mosquito-ocentrism. Now, what would a mosquito centrist be mostly concerned about? The life and well-being of a mosquito. And there are mosquito centrists. They generally throw a wider net than just mosquitoes, but there are people who believe that it is unethical to kill a mosquito, or to kill a fly, or to kill anything like this, because there is an inherent value to biological life. On the other hand, I might be more of a grandchild-ocentrist. And I'm walking in the yard with my grandchild, and a tick lands on his neck. Now, I have the choice right there to operate on the basis of grandchild centrism or on tick centrism. Guess what I'm going to do? What I'm going to do is to get that tick and squash him. Now, from the perspective of certain absolutists, that is an arrogant thing to do. And so what we have in a lot of discussions concerning environmentalism are a great many arrogant people who are fighting with each other about what is most valuable. Is the environment as a whole so valuable that we should do nothing that might have any consequences of harming the environment, even though it might harm human life? Generally, environmentalism began as a kind of an anthropocentrism. All of the basic documents of environmentalism are anthrocentric, except the Bible. The Bible are basic documents of environmentalism, but they are theocentric. But in the modern world, the basic documents of environmentalism are anthrocentric. That is, they believe that we should protect and heal the environment for the benefit of persons who are alive today and for our children. Well, that is anthropocentric. Now, we're not going to list all of these kinds of centrism, because what Banner finally comes to, the position Banner finally comes to, is the position that there's nothing necessarily wrong with any of these centrisms. For instance, there is a very important need for anthrocentrism or anthropocentrism, because human beings are very valuable to us. And so, for instance, if I want my grandchildren to live in a city in which they don't die of pollution, my position there is basically anthropocentric or anthrocentric. By extension, however, it is also environmental centric, because how are my grandchildren going to benefit by my action? They're only going to benefit by my action if I turn my attention to cleaning up the environment. And so anti-anthrocentric versus anthrocentric, from Banner's perspective, is a kind of a useless distinction. Because some things that I want to do as a Christian, I want to do primarily because it's going to benefit human beings now and in the future. But some things I want to do, I'm going to do because it's going to affect positively the environment and save the environment. But there is no conflict between those. Things come in conflict only when you absolutize one of the centrisms. When you absolutize a human-centric ethic, then what from the biblical perspective have you done to human beings? You have elevated them to the status of God. And so nothing matters except the protection of human beings. If you are ethnocentric, what have you done? What have you elevated to the status of God? Or what can you elevate to the status of God? You can elevate your own ethnic background to the status of God. That's what the world, that's what the church of the world creator does. It's ethnocentric. It elevates white people to God. Now, so ethnocentric, anthrocentric, zoocentric, environmental centrism, all of these can operate on two different levels. They can operate on the level in which human beings are protected because of their value. Or it can operate on the perspective that human beings are God and that therefore we have no responsibility for the protecting of anybody else but human beings. And even worse, and an even worse kind of anthropocentrism, is that we have no responsibility for protecting anybody but capitalists and business people. And the economy. So you see, none of these things are evil within themselves, being focused on the well-being of human beings. That's one of the things Christians should be involved in, is to be focused on the well-being of human beings. A Christian can also be involved in being focused on the well-being of the environment. A Christian can also be focused on the well-being of animal life. A Christian can also be focused on the well-being of lakes and streams and whatever else. In fact, a Christian who is theocentric must in some way be all those things. Why? Because a person who's theocentric, human beings are not the center of their ethic. Animals are not the center of their ethic. The environment is not the center of their ethic. Their grandchildren are not the center of their ethic. God is the center of their ethic. And what God requires is love toward all of these of God's creations, because they are God's creations. He created them on purpose. They have some value to Him. There is therefore no way for a Christian, especially one that's based on biblical understanding of creation and redemption, there's no way for a Christian to go off and join any particular exclusive sectarian centrism. Sometimes Christians do that. They become ethnocentric, and sometimes they hurt people to defend their particular religious ethnocentrism. They can become religious-centric. They can become animal-centric. They can become life-centric. They can become, fish-centric. They can become forest-centric. And from the Christian perspective, there should be, there may not be, but I think there should be Christians who are involved in all of these efforts to protect God's creation. There should be Christians who are involved in efforts to protect the air. There should be Christians involved in efforts to protect the streams, the oceans, the earth in general. Christians should be involved in protecting space and outer space from human abuse. Christians should also be involved in the protection of the human race as a whole. Christians should also be involved in the protection, for instance, if you live in a community, the protection of the people in your community. If you're involved in a nation, you should be involved in the protection of the people in your nation. If you're involved in a world community, you should be involved in the protection of the people in your world community. That's not being halfway between being environmental centric and being anthrocentric. That's transcending. That's what Banner means by transcending. If you are God-centered, then you will love human beings. You will love human beings who are now alive. You will love human beings who have yet to be born. If you are God-centered, then you will love the non-living creation, because it is the context in which God has provided your created life. In Judaism, Christianity, human beings were created as human beings, which means they were created as animals. They were created as physical beings. They were created within an environment. So you cannot be a human being without, as my granddaughter says, a habitat. You cannot be a human being without a habitat. So any Christian who is not concerned about the preservation of human habitat and also the preservation of animal habitat can be working. Nobody can be working from a Christian ethic who is not concerned about habitat. Nobody can be concerned about a Christian ethic who is not concerned about the impact of capitalism and industrialism on the environment, on the health of human beings. No one who is a Christian ethicist can be unconcerned about tribalism or ethnocentrism or any other kind of ism that actually is concerned only about one little part of the human being or one little part of the human race. So you see, what he's saying is, you can be mosquito-centric. In other words, you don't necessarily have to get a bunch of spray and go out in the middle of the Amazon jungle and try to kill all the mosquitoes. But even being mosquito-centric in a lesser way, that may mean that under certain circumstances your grandson centricity may overrule your mosquito centricity, and you may actually slap the way out of that mosquito. On the other hand, there may be a bigger issue in mind. That is, that you may not want to go out, especially if mosquitoes have some very important part to play in our ecosystem. Even if a mosquito has a very important part to play in our ecosystem, he doesn't have to play that on my grandson. You understand what I'm saying? So I can make these ethical decisions, and I can actually work, perhaps, to preserve a particular species of mosquito. Now, I use the mosquito because they're not as cute as some of these other species that we're trying to preserve. But being environmentally conscious does not necessarily involve narrowing down your concerns to one part of creation. For a Christian to be environmentally conscious means that he can't narrow his interest down to any one part of creation, human or animal or non-animal, because his environmentalism is theocentric. Who created the environment? Human beings didn't. The environment does not belong to human beings. They have been given power to use the environment. For instance, they've been given power, for instance, to drink water. And they have every right to drink water. There may come an ethical decision when they have to decide whether their drinking water is actually taking away the possibility of someone downstream drinking water. Then it becomes an ethical decision. And then you may have to work to make sure that all human beings over which you have any control or power get enough water. And so you have to be egocentric in the sense if there's enough water for you to drink and you want to stay alive, you can drink it. You don't have to take the water that you need to stay alive and put it in a package and send it to Africa. You can be egocentric to that extent. But you can't be egocentric to the extent that someone downstream is not going to have any water if I get my family together and we dam up the lake, and so they have to suffer. And so you just keep going up the line as far as Christian ethics is concerned, till you get to animals, and most animal protection societies began as either Jewish or Christian societies. The first laws for the protection of animals come in the Ten Commandments. The first laws for the protection of animals' rights and animals protecting animals from pain and so forth come out of the Jewish law. And in fact, that's one place where Christians, because they came from pagan backgrounds, did not pick up very heavily on the Jewish concern for animals. And so that's one thing that Christians are kind of behind the curve on. So they need to pick back up on the Jewish concern for animal life. And that might change their whole way of looking at things. And it might change, for instance, their attitude toward environmental concerns. So what Banner is saying is, the question is usually debated in wrong terms. Being for human-centered ethic or being against human-centered ethic. And there is no reason for this dichotomy. Being for human-centered, being human-centered does not necessarily mean that you are anti-non-human. And being anti-non-human does not necessarily mean that you should not be concerned about the human implications of certain policies. But if you were just to look at that's the reason why many environmentalists who I would love to see have great influence on our environmental policies in America will probably have very little, because they actually give weight to the idea that these oligarchs and capitalists who run all of these big polluting companies are wise and calm and democratic. You don't want to do that. You don't want to make the assumption that the people who own oil companies are, just by the very nature of the fact that they are owning oil companies, are ecologically sensitive. You want to try to make sure that you get your message into these people, and that somehow or another they're struck with the idea that they do not own the resources of this world. But if you are totally anthropocentric, they do. You understand what I'm saying? They do. They own most of it. They have deeds that prove that they own most of it. So the message that has to be communicated to people who think they own the land is that they don't own it. But you're not going to convince them that they don't own it because you do, because they've got the deed to prove it. You might convince them that they don't own it because God does. And you see, that puts the whole discussion in a completely different frame of reference. And it's quite possible, because I've seen it happen. It's quite possible for people who have made millions of dollars working for oil companies, working for companies which generally are responsible for a great deal of pollution, to have come to the conclusion, you know, you're right. This doesn't belong to me. They might get so far as to say, this belongs to the people. But if they don't get that far, at least they can get far enough to say, this belongs to God. And once you admit that everything that you have and everything that you have control over belongs to God, then you can finally determine that it also belongs to other people. And you can have an ethical position. Okay, next time we will try to sum up these chapters on sexual ethics. Now that's a real problematic area.